So, last night I was surfing the ever colorful and fun world of Reddit when I ran into a post that absolutely lit my brain on fire. And it was someone sharing a picture from a surgery where someone had gotten their face altered via plastic surgery somehow to make themselves look Korean. Now, this picture from this person was a claim about identifying as transracial. Now, normally I try not to jump into incredibly incendiary topics, but this is something that just absolutely just fascinated me, because the post was actually about linking transracial identification with transgendered identification. And the person in the post immediately lamented the fact that the right wing was going to use this transracial identification as a way to kind of make a comment on transgendered identification. And of course, that's pretty much what happened, right? People like Ben Shapiro jumped in on this conversation and started making the claim that if you don't support or agree with this equivocation, that you are bigoted. Now, for a moment, as I read this claim and as I looked at the arguments, I actually was a little stumped. This is a difficult question. And the people who were trying to respond to this claim about basically equating these these transracialism with transgenderism, they weren't doing a particularly good job at it. Most of them were saying things like race is race. Someone on the right wing would be able to respond with, well, gender is gender. And others were saying things like, well, there's no psychological proof and there's no studies about this. It's very easy for someone in psychology to come along and do a kind of study that would potentially substantiate it. So, in short, this was a little bit of a mess. And I started thinking, how can we separate these two things and actually give an answer to someone who wants to say that transracial identity is the same thing as transgendered identity? And it took me quite a while, but I think I have an answer to the question. Now, let me throw something out there before I get into this. This is not an attack on anybody. But from a rhetorical standpoint, this is purely rhetorical. I think it is possible to stand up for one and not the other. And here's the basis by which I'm going to try to say that this is possible. The experience of race is very, very diverse amongst humanity. There are lots of different races. And your racial identification or your racial identity is dependent on a lot of factors, including things like your geography, right? Where the race is from. There's also a lot of biological markers for race. Now, someone in my family recently got tested to see what our heritage was and what races we were comprised of. And it was no surprise to learn that we are mostly Scandinavian. We're I think 80% Scandinavian. I mean, duh, right? There were some trace amounts of things like, I think, Western Europe and maybe Irish. So, with that test, here's the first point. There's absolutely no part of me that is related in any way to African racial heritage, right? It's just not there. At least not in any detectable way. So we already have a bit of an issue here that for me to claim and say that I identify as African or Korean is quite the stretch, because there's absolutely no trace of that racial designation within me. Now, what separates this from gender identification? Well, in actuality, the experience of gender is much, much more universal than race is. Race is universal in the sense that we all have a race that we identify, that we have markers for. But there's that wide divergence. But here's where things actually get interesting. The actual base for the entire human race, the base template of the human model, is female. We are all, in some regards, female. Males are modified females, right? We're female with like a slight variation on our construction so that our bodies and our reproductive systems behave in a slightly different way. But the base is absolutely female. Now, you see this across nature. Like, and I know that this is always kind of a bit of a thorny game to get into, but when you look at like termites, the non-sexually active drones, all are female. So like the base of the species is female. Now, how do I know this is true for humans, other than the fact that I've read a bunch of papers about it, stuff like that? If you think that the base of the human animal is not female, I invite you to explain to me why men have nipples, right? Those traces of that feminine base are there, but we're just simply modified. Now, the reason that this is important for this conversation is I have no Black ancestry. I had no Korean ancestry. I have no Chinese ancestry. But I do have a great deal of genetic marker for female, right? That I have the X chromosomes. I am capable of producing female offspring, right? All of this means that, like, quintessentially, there is a great deal of femaleness that's encoded into my maleness. So it's much less of a stretch for me as a man to identify as female as it is for me to identify as a race with which I have no genetic markers whatsoever. So I had to come in and record this video because I felt like I potentially had an interesting, way to hop in on this subject. Again, I'm not trying to attack people who have transracial identification, but I do feel that there is a great deal of distinction between transgendered identification and transracial identification. There's a lot more of a basis to say that you identify as a different gender or different sex. I know. There's a lot of differences between gender and sex, and oftentimes we use those, interchangeably, right? The sex base of termites is female. The sex base of the human race is female, right? So, and at the very least, the identification comes from the fact that those actual markers are within you, whereas in a lot of cases with transracial identification, they're not. Now, this does kind of leave open an interesting door. If I had 10% of African, ancestry, could I identify as African? I would say that's a heck of a stretch, and I don't think that would be, I don't think that would work very well. But that's just me. So, in any case, I invite your comments. I find conversations like this absolutely fascinating. And thank you. Have a good morning.